textbooks? And the answer is, well, that's incorrect. It's totally incorrect. For the answer is, the DNA is covered by regulatory proteins. And to get the regulatory proteins off, the sleeve off so I can read the gene, I need an environmental signal. So the bottom line is this: you're not controlled by DNA, you're controlled by environmental signals. And this is what Niehaut writes in his paper. Just reading the yellow lines is the answer. You are not controlled by genes before it's a signal from its environment that activates the expression of the gene. So all of a sudden it says, wait a minute, then I'm not genetically determined? No, you're environmentally determined. And all of a sudden, so we have to talk about how does that happen? Let me explain the mechanism. First of all, what is the environment? Well, the environment, there are two environments that affect all of us. There's an internal environment under your skin, the environment of your physiology, your blood composition, the temperature of your body, the amount of sugar in your body, the amount of nutrients available, the information. This is the environment on the inside. Yet, what is the other environment? The environment on the outside controls us. Why? Because when we live in that environment, we have to adjust ourselves to what's ever happening. And to adjust ourselves, then we change our genes to adjust to the environmental signals, because the environmental signals elicit the gene action. So the question is, so where's the brain of the cell? And the answer is, the brain of the cell is the membrane. It is the skin of the cell. What about our belief that the brain of the cell was the nucleus? And the answer is this: science is a male-dominated profession. And since males think with this, they made the brain of the cell. But the bottom line, I'll tell you what the nucleus is. The nucleus is the gonad of the cell. Why? What is the function of the nucleus? To make the programs and blueprints to replace the parts. So when I need new parts, I go to the gonad to give me reproduction. So the nucleus is for reproduction. It's not for brain. The brain of the cell is the membrane. And I don't have a lot of time to go into exactly why, but you have to understand that the membrane is the most primitive structure in biology. The most primitive organisms have just a single membrane. They don't have anything else in that. And all their functions come from the membrane. So if we understand the membrane, we can then understand how it works. So let me illustrate, for example, how it works. Here are cells on a surface of a culture dish, and if I look at the membrane and I cut into the surface of the cell, this is what we see. That the surface of the cell looks like this layered structure right here that separates the outside environment from the inside environment. The yellow in the middle is like oil, and as a result, the membrane is a barrier that separates the outside from the inside, because water can't go through the middle of the membrane and carry information across. So the self on the inside, under the membrane, is separated from the environment on the outside. But this wouldn't do any functions. This is just protection. To do function, I need the protein that does movement. Proteins do the movement. Proteins do the function. So like I showed you in my poppet bead version of the proteins, that these poppet beads insert themselves into that membrane structure that I showed you. And so the proteins stick inside the membrane. There are two classes of proteins in the membrane. They're very important. One set is called receptors. What's a receptor? Do you have receptors? Of course you do. What? Name some. Skin. Name some other ones that people are pretty obvious about. Eyes, ears, nose, taste, touch. Where are all the receptors located? In your skin. And the same with the cell. But in the cell, they're not organized into these structures that we see, but the proteins have antennas on them. And each different thing the cell can see has a different protein with a different antenna. So for insulin, I have a receptor that sees insulin. For glucose, I have a receptor that sees glucose. For light, I have a receptor that responds to photons of light. So for everything the cell can see, there's a special receptor inside the cell. And then the receptor is for what? Taking signals in. That's what receptors do. I see through my receptors. But now when the signals come in, I have to make a behavior to respond to the signal. That's the other set of proteins. The example that I'm going to use from the other set is called a channel. A channel means a canal. And the point about it is, in the resting state, the channel is closed. Nothing can go through the channel. But in an activated state, the channel opens up, and there's a tunnel that goes from one side of the membrane to the other. Let me explain how they work. This is an example of the receptor. Let's explain how it works. The receptor sits in the membrane, has an antenna sticking up, and look at the bottom. Watch what happens when a signal comes in. The signal, remember, the environmental signals cause a conformation change. So look at the shape. So if I'm inside the cell, I know if the signal is there because I can look at it. But when the signal goes away, then the confirmation goes back. So remember, I showed you this. Confirmation 1, confirmation 2. What was the difference between 1 and 2? The signal. So when a signal comes in, the antenna receptor changes its structure. Now, the other proteins, the channel looks like this. When we look at the channels inside the membrane, they too float around inside the membrane, but a channel is different because a channel is closed. And we said the channel works when it opens up. So when a signal comes in, it opens up, and then information or molecules can shoot down the tunnel, down into the cell. And it can only do it when it opens and closes. But look, the wrong size signals don't go in. So the channels regulate which things can get in by opening and closing. So what we looked at is this. We saw signals come into antennas and change the structure of the receptor. And we saw that the output device, in this case a channel, can open or close when the signal comes in. Now let's put them together and see what happens when they come together. And the answer is this. The antenna on the left is going to scan the environment. Notice the shape of the protein inside the cell. It's a smooth tube. This is a connector called the G protein. Look at its shape. Can it plug onto that? Yes or no? No, look at the shape. It won't fit. So that when no signal is there, that connector doesn't connect. But when the signal shows in, it changes the shape, connects this one to this one, changes this one, and this makes a signal. So I have an environmental signal coming in the antenna, and then the channel on the right converts that signal into behavior. Do you understand? It's a switch. So let's see if I can do this one again. If I can show it to you again, it works like this. Again, watch this. This is what controls biology. Antennas receive the signal from the environment, and when a signal is received, it changes the shape of the protein and allows the connecting device to connect the receptor to the output. The output is the channel. The channel creates a signal that enters into the cell, and that signal that now is going to go enter into the cell activates the functions of the cell. It causes the cell to move. It causes the cell to digest things. It causes the cell to change its structure or behavior. So the fact is what? This is a signaling device. This is the actual device that controls the behavior of the cell. So how does it work? Well, the receptor picks up a stimulus, right? Say yeah or no. So we go like, yeah. Okay, yeah. And then the output goes through the channel because the channel is closed, and when the signal comes, the channel opens, and then the signal goes down and activates the functions of the cell. So the stimulus is received by the receptor, and the response is produced by the channel or the effector. So when I put that together, what does it mean? It says this. It says stimulus response, that biology is stimulus response, that the inputs, the signals from the environment, are collected by the receptors, and the receptors read the environment, whether they're reading the external environment or the internal environment. But once they receive a signal, I get a response. That's the output. Behavior is a response. So the output is mediated by effectors, such as the channel. So the bottom line is this. Environmental signals elicit behavior. Got it? If I remove the environmental signals, what behavior do I have? None. And this is an interesting point. As I said, I could take the nucleus out of the cell. I don't change the behavior at all. But if I go to the cell and cut off the antennas, the cell has no behavior. Now just think for a second. Stop and just think for the profound meaning of what this says. Then the behavior you're expressing is what? A reflection of the signals that come from the environment. So all of a sudden, your behavior is not coming from the inside as much as it's totally a reflection of what you see on the outside. And so that this is changing your life is through this. But this device is what controls the cell. That there are thousands and thousands of these input and output devices controlling the cell. Now, is it clear at least that how this acts as a switch? Say yes or no so I know we're doing okay. Well, if now you recognize that each one of these things can activate a function of the cell. Now, this is the beautiful part because I'm going to let you say the words. Is it true or not that the receptor represents awareness of the environment? Okay. Is it true or not that when the channels or whatever the output devices are start to create a physical response, that they create a physical sensation in the cell? Okay, so is this what controls the cell, or at least a function within the cell, yes or no? What is this called? And the answer is, in the dictionary, there is a word for this. And the word is perception. Awareness of the environment through physical sensation. And basically, so you just saw the labeling of what? A device that controls the cell. What is this device that controls the cell? Known as perception. So are you controlled by genes? No. You're controlled by perception. Perception is how you read the environment and adjust your behavior. It makes sense because if your behavior is linked to the environment, then you're coordinated with the environment. If your behavior is not connected to what's going on in the environment, you're out of sync, and that actually is neurological problems in many cases when your behavior doesn't fit the environment. So the point about it is this: cells started to come together into community. And why this was relevant is each cell is reading what it should do by reading the environment. But when cells start to come together in a community to make a multicellular organism like you or myself, then something has to happen. What's different about the individual versus a community? And it's this: if I'm just a free living cell, I can walk around and do anything I want and it doesn't make any difference. But if I join a community, then the word community has meaning. It means communication. It means holding it together. That as an individual cell in the community, I can't do what I want to do. I have to do what the community agrees. That's part of the deal. If I give up my independence, I give it up to join the community. But the reason for joining the community is I've got greater chance of survival with more members all working together. That's what community is all about. That's why people came together to form communities instead of living alone, because community brings greater life. But when I look at that, then here's the important understanding. If a cell doesn't listen to the community's voice, then the cell is not part of the community. Cancer cells have withdrawn from the community. They're still in there, but they're not listening to the voice of the community. They're doing their own thing. Why would some cells get out of the community? And the answer is, why are people homeless? Why are people out of work, or why are people separating? If the community is not supporting them, at some point the cells recognize, my God, what do I want to be in this for? So there's a point that cancer starts to recognize as a result of breakdown of community. Well, let's look at cells moving in community. This is a movement of a bunch of cells, and I'm going to show you the communication using a special dye. I can show you how the cells are communicating in this community. There's a dye that you can see the nervous connection of cells. Now in this one, the dye lights up. It's a fluorescent dye. Now you see the sparkling and flashing? That's the neurological process of each individual cell. But watch what happens. Waves of information start. Why? Because the cells are connected to each other. So the actions of some cells are spreading to other cells. So what you're actually looking at, it's sort of like an electroencephalograph of cells. You're watching cells talking to each other because cells work together in a community. When the community falls apart, that's when disease starts to happen, because that means that they're not, for some reason, they're not being supported, and that will then lead to the end of the community. So the point about it is this: each cell has a brain. That's a fact. Each cell can read the environment and adjust its function for whatever it sees. But when cells get in a community, they defer their own belief system or their own system of what they're seeing to the central command. So as you can see here, I have a cell here on the right-hand side, marked in purple over here, that this cell is out here in the environment. But what should its function be? Well, the answer is it's going to be coordinated by the brain, because the brain is going to tell all the cells what we should do to work together to provide for the success of my living organism. So the brain gets in between the environment and the cell. The cell no longer reads its own environment. The cell depends on the central nervous system to tell us about the environment. So the bottom line is this: the cell on the right is intelligent. It will always be able to adjust itself to the environment. That's when